Thank you for inviting me once again for the Bodhi Day talk. I'm really thrilled to be here and connect with all of you again. It's my greatest joy to be able to contribute to the RK Sangha in North America and Europe. And I've been looking forward to connecting with all of you again. And one of the reasons why I really like to connect with you is because I learned so much from my interactions and encounters with the members of the RK Dharma centers in North America. And so my relationship with all of you is very, very precious to me. Today, I'd like to talk about the last third of the Lotus Sutra. And by last third of the Lotus Sutra, I mean the applicational section, or in Japanese, the Ritsubun. And that's the part of the sutra that begins in the middle of chapter 17, traditionally speaking, and extends to the end of the sutra. Yeah. The heart of this section are the stories of several bodhisattvas and their practices and virtues. As Rissho Kosei-kai founder Reverend Niwano Nikkyo observes in his commentaries on the Lotus Sutra, the latter chapters of the Lotus Sutra, especially those after chapter 22, don't introduce very much in the way of new doctrinal content. For all intents and purposes, Shakyamuni's doctrinal teachings of the Lotus Sutra end around the conclusion of chapter 22. So the chapters, 23 and onward tell the stories of several bodhisattvas and contain many fantastic images and fantastical stories that might seem like, as founder Niwano describes it, something out of a fantasy world. So because of the lack of doctrinal content and because of the characters and images, because they seem so unbelievable and sometimes strike us as elements of ancient mythology, in our modern scientific age, many people tend to ignore this section of the sutra or read it less often than the other parts of the sutra. When we do read this section of the sutra, we often tend to explain the strange characters and fantastic stories by interpreting them as symbolism or metaphors. No doubt we are correct in seeing the content and personas that appear in these chapters as symbols or as metaphors that convey certain ideas or concepts and principles. We do this because we do not have the mythic vision of our ancestors. This is because several hundred years ago, there began a revolution in our way of knowing, beginning with the scientific revolution, followed by the Protestant Revolution in Christianity, and later the Enlightenment intellectual and philosophical movement. As the scholar Gary Lachman summarizes, in the early 17th century, a new way of knowing and understanding ourselves in the world we live in appeared in the West and quickly rose to prominence. So effective and powerful was this new approach to knowledge that within a relatively short time, merely a few centuries, it achieved an ascendancy in practically all fields of human endeavor, and subsequently became, as it is today, the gauge by which we measure such difficult and fundamental notions as truth and reality. To be sure, this revolution had earlier roots in our historical past, but as Lachman continues to explain, this revolution was a complete break with what had come before. Our shift away from a mythic worldview to a scientific worldview has facilitated the great social, technological, and medical leaps that humankind has taken in its history. We've gone as far as reach for the stars, but everything has a cost. Our leaps have separated us from our ancient stories, and we have, in the words of the famous philosopher Nietzsche, killed God. We have disenchanted our world, and while we can explain it very well in scientific terms, our world, our cosmos, is not a moral cosmos. It is not an ordered world of moral significance and meaning any longer. The absence of meaning in the lives of many of us, and more broadly in our civilization, is what the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke calls a meaning crisis. Our world is no longer a magical place for many of us. It is no longer animated, and it no longer speaks back to us. The power of the scientific view, according to Lachman, is that it reduces reality to what it can abstract and apply to useful means. influenced by the scientific worldview, today we often see the useful concepts, laws, and theories and so forth that science abstracts out of the world as what is really real. While the world we encounter and love and struggle with in our own lives is kind of a subjective illusion housed within the individual island of our consciousness. This way of looking at things is closely related to how we approach our ancient stories. It is one of the causes of our tendency to use interpretation to explain away the fantastic stories and symbolic personas and only deal with the concepts that we distill from them. Once we have extracted the teachings that the symbolic characters embody, and we understand the moral of the mythical stories, we tend to usher the symbolic personas and stories off the stage, and we don't really deal with them. After having deciphered or read the symbolism, we no longer need the symbols, the stories, the metaphors in these kind of religious stories. And we hardly interact with them, and we hardly ever ponder them. On the one hand, interpreting the personas, images, and stories of the Lotus Sutra to extract rational ideas and messages is a way of making the sutra relevant for our contemporary scientific and materialistic civilization. On the other hand, interpretation can also be a way of dismissing or doing away with the personas and stories of symbolic and metaphorical content. Sometimes you may hear people talk about such content in the sutra as just a symbol or only metaphor. Modern people often seem to be trying to get beyond these stories and characters that are incompatible with our scientific and materialistic view of the world. Let me be clear, as Barack Obama often said, I am not against interpreting the symbolism and metaphors of the Lotus Sutra, but if we interpret so that we can dismiss or avoid interacting with the characters and stories of the Lotus Sutra, I think we lose something precious. I think we end up throwing away the proverbial baby out with the bathwater. Going back to the person I just quoted, Lackman, and to several other theologians, scholars of religious studies, psychologists, and cognitive scientists, one of the costs of the revolution in our way of knowing has been a loss of spiritual imagination. What they mean is that the art of using the imagination as a way of spiritual knowing and transforming ourselves has become a lost art. Not for all of us, but for many of us. Now, Buddhism has always interpreted stories and characters of its sutras as metaphors and symbols. But at the same time, it doesn't really very often dismiss or throw away these personas and their stories after it interprets them. Alongside interpretation, Buddhism has historically always used the mythical stories and archetypical personas to liberate people from suffering and lead them to awakening. I think you can also see this combination of both the rational and the mythical view in the teachings of founder Niwano of Rissho Kosei-kai. Founder Niwano on the one hand, strongly emphasizes that the fantastic stories that appear in the Lotus Sutra are not descriptions of a dream world, but allegories that are told on the basis of carefully thought out reason. And this is a quote from the upcoming new translation of Buddhism for Today. So you're going to get snippets of that today. And it's going to be out soon, I promise. A few more months. We're getting there. It'll be there. It'll be there. I hope you appreciate it. But alongside Founder Niwano's rational interpretive approach to Lotus Sutra, we also, in many cases, see an imaginal mythical vision in Founder Niwano. And I think people sometimes struggle with this mythic view. For example, one of the things in the history of Rissho Kosei-kai that exemplifies this is how Rissho Kosei-kai changed its focus of devotion from this Nichiren symbolic representation of the ultimate reality of the Lotus Sutra, his mandala. Kosei-kai changed to a personified image of the eternal original Buddha as the focus of devotion. Now, the eternal original Buddha as a personification of ultimate truth is something that I spoke about a year ago, and I've got a Dharma World article about that. Now, to give another example of the mythic view in Founder Niwano, Founder Niwano will use terms, very many terms that personify, like, for example, the arrangements of the Buddha or the arrangement of the Buddha. Now, I think recently that appeared in one of President Niwano's monthly talks. Now, Founder Niwano used the arrangements of the Buddha, this phrase, or in Japanese, hotoke no hakarai, to teach that everything that we encounter in life, both that which seems good and that which seems bad to us, to be part of our path to Buddhahood. Also, he often described true liberation as the realization that the Buddha is always alongside us, always together with us. The way that Founder Niwano personified the Buddha in such imaginal, mythical ways is something that I know many in the North American Sangha sometimes have trouble with. The applicational section of the Lotus Sutra is filled with these kind of symbolic personas and mythical stories. It presents a kind of mythical view. And because these characters personify the inherent powers of our Buddha nature, emulating the Bodhisattvas of the applicational section of the Lotus Sutra is very important to liberating ourselves and others from suffering and aspiring to the highest awakening. But today, I would try to persuade you that in order to transform ourselves by emulating these bodhisattvas, in addition to interpreting them, it is also very skillful to imaginally interact with them as personas. And then we can resonate with them, establishing a channel of communication between our hearts and theirs. And finally, we can embody them. Furthermore, placing ourselves into the stories of the Lotus Sutra by making sense of our lives from within their narratives and adopting them as a kind of corrective lenses that allow us to see the world through the eyes of the Buddha is an important way that the applicational section of the sutra can transform our lives. Now, before we go any further, let's clarify Rissho Kosei-kai's understanding of mindfulness of the bodhisattvas as models, using Founder Niwano's discussion of the bodhisattva regarder of the sounds of the world. First, Founder Niwano makes it clear that the focus of devotion of Rissho Kosei-kai is the eternal Buddha Shakyamuni, not the sound regarder and not other bodhisattvas in the Lotus Sutra. And liberation is, because, as he explains, is because of the eternal Buddha. Now, as I discussed last year in some of my pieces in Dharma World, the eternal Buddha Shakyamuni can be considered a personification of the truth that pervades everything in the universe. Everything arises according to this truth, and everything embodies it. And Siddhartha Gautama, when he was enlightened, embodied it and became one with it 2,500 years ago on Bodhi Day. And he attained full and complete liberation. Thus, supreme perfect awakening is because of this truth. And liberation is the awareness of this truth, both inside of us, in the world around us, and in other people. In other words, supreme perfect awakening is because of the eternal Buddha. Bodhisattvas, in contrast, do the work of the eternal Buddha in the world. They are exemplars, models for us of how to practice. At the same time, however, Founder Niwano talks about the sound regarder in ways that make no sense if we think that our task is only to distill the symbolic meaning out of the Bodhisattva and its stories and intellectually understand them. First, Founder Niwano talks about forming a mental image of the sound regarder. Now, this is all from the New Translation of Buddhism for Today. The practice of calling to mind the regarder of sounds that the Buddha encourages in this chapter means to form a mental image of the Bodhisattva as an expression of our adoration for her as someone we want to emulate. If we focus our minds on such an exemplar with a deep sense of admiration, we will surely come to manifest their qualities in ourselves by making them a reality through our own conduct. Now, forming this mental image and admiring it is a way to manifest the qualities of the image of the imaginal persona. Founder Niwano next describes how pondering the Bodhisattva makes our minds resonate with the Bodhisattva's mind. And he writes, calling to mind means to ponder something. We should remember that the Bodhisattva regarder of sounds of the world, our model, has taken a great vow to discern the inner voice within the hearts of all people and to help eliminate their sufferings. We must remind ourselves of the Bodhisattva's gentleness, her spirit of self-sacrifice, and her compassionate countenance, face, full of warmth. If we recall all of these qualities, our mind will resonate with the mind of the regarder of sounds by inviting a sympathetic response between her mind and our own. So what does the founder Nibbana mean by sympathetic response? Resonate in this case, another term for sympathetic response, means to spontaneously attain the same state of mind as the Bodhisattva regarder of the sounds of the world. The phrase sympathetic response is often used to characterize this sort of phenomenon. If we call to mind the regarder of the sounds of the world, pondering all her qualities, we can make her mind our own. Now, in these passages, these two passages, we see that founder Nibbana is not reducing the sound regarder merely to an idea or a concept. He is speaking as if the sound regarder were a real person. And he seems to be imagining the sound regarder's appearance and character. These passages are not merely interpretations to distill the meaning of the sound regarder to nothing but a symbol or metaphor, or purely metaphor. We see here the creation of an imaginal space where there is contact with the sound regarder as a persona, as if a real person. Let me share with you another example of how founder Nibbana enters an imaginal space when discussing a bodhisattva in this latter part of the Lotus Sutra. Now, this example comes from the founder's commentary on chapter 20. Chapter 20 is about the bodhisattva never unworthy of respect in the new translation, or never disparaging bodhisattva. There are many translations for the bodhisattva's name. I'm sure you probably recognize him or her. Although this chapter gives us, okay, so this is the founder speaking. Although this chapter gives us no detailed descriptions of any particular place, the story itself brings to mind scenes of everyday life in a corner of any average town today. The characters that appear in this chapter evoke images of common, ordinary people we might see anywhere. The meaning of the words monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen does not necessarily indicate only monastics and practitioners of Buddhism, but includes all of the types of people we might come across in the center of any run-of-the-mill town. A soldier home on leave, young roughnecks loitering around the town, shrewd middle-aged shopkeepers, good-natured but strong-willed restaurant owners, and hotel managers. Mingling among these people, we can also picture swaggering scholar monks boasting of their complete mastery of Buddhism and its doctrines, smug middle-aged monastics proud of their strict observance of the precepts, and elderly monks who have come to town to beg for alms, standing aloof on street corners without ever preaching even a single sermon for almsgivers. The protagonist of this chapter, Bodhisattva never unworthy of respect, brings to mind the image of a young monk we come across in the neighborhood who looks serious yet slightly peculiar, but also strikes us as having something dignified about him. While it's safe to say that the entire Lotus Sutra possesses a highly refined literary style, chapter 20 feels closest to a modern short story or novella. Its deeply human qualities make for a narrative that also feels easily accessible to us. Notice all the language of imagination in this passage brings to mind, evoke images, picture. Here again, the founder brings us to an imaginal place, and he fills in the details not provided by the story in the sutra. In this passage, he's experiencing the story's deeply human qualities in an imaginal place. In this imaginal place, founder Nibbana participates in the story of the sutra, bringing it to life in his mind, making his heart the screen upon which the images of the stories appear. These sections of founder Nibbana's writings read so differently from many other sections in his writings. In other sections, he is working to make rational sense of the fantastic images and stories of the Lotus Sutra to convince the reader to take the sutra seriously. Here, however, founder Niwano is doing something different. He's engaging the Bodhisattva and as if a real person. And in the case of the story of Never Unworthy, he's imaginally participating in the allegory in addition to explaining it. Here, the founder is interacting with the mythic or the archetypical personas and stories and imaginally entering the stories. Now, I hold that doing these things is an effective and important way of transforming oneself through practice. It's not just something left over from an older, more primitive, pre-modern religiosity. I think it's an effective way to practice that is perfectly attuned to the way the human heart works. And I think it's an essential part of how the Lotus Sutra, specifically the last third of the Lotus Sutra, transforms people and leads them to liberation and initiates awakening. Now, my foil would say to me, after distilling the meaning of the image of the sound regarder, what need do we have for the image of the persona of the sound regarder? If we know the meaning of the stories of the Bodhisattva, why enter into them imaginally? We already have the moral of the story, so to speak. So why invest time and energy into entering such a fantastic and mythical story that we modern people can hardly read literally? Now, thinkers in psychology, cognitive science, and other fields are giving us answers to this type of question. And those answers cause us to reconsider modernity's dismissal of engaging with traditional religious imagery and stories through our imaginations. Given the limited amount of time we have together today, in this section of the talk, I will give only a broad outline of such ideas. And then perhaps afterwards, we can go into more depth in the discussion time if you'd like. Now, first, with regard to symbolic images, the reason to bring them to mind, to contemplate them, to interact with symbolic images is because, and this is the argument of many scholars, is that symbolic images are they're the articulation of our deep minds. They are the primary stuff, so to speak, of the subconscious. Thus, symbolic images have a great power to impact the depths of our minds. Symbolic images also allow us to experience ideas. And many philosophers hold that language is the primary stuff of our subconsciousness. But there are some exceptions. One, for example, was Jacques Lacan. Another was Carl Jung. And another more recent person who advocated this view was the psychologist James Hillman, who was a student of Carl Jung and a founder of the archetypal school of psychology, which held that fantasy images of the type in our dreams and daydreams are the primary data of our psyches. For Hillman, he said, in the beginning is the image. Now that's a pun on a biblical passage. In the beginning was the word. Hillman says, in the beginning was the image. Now, according to Hillman, fantasy images are both the raw materials and the finished products of the psyche. And they are the privileged mode of access to knowledge of the soul. Nothing is more primary. Every notion in our minds, each perception of the world and sensation in ourselves must go through a psychic organization in order to happen at all. Every single feeling or observation occurs as psychic events by first forming a fantasy image. Now, Hillman follows Carl Jung's position that ideas, perceptions of the world, feelings, and more must present themselves as images in order to be experienced. Jung had developed the philosopher Kant's notion that imagination is important for learning. And Jung came to the conclusion that experience is, in its most simple form, an exceedingly complicated structure of mental images. As you may know, Jung's understanding of the structure and workings of our deep minds was garnered from his exploration of dreams. Dreams do have linguistic content. We do hear language and engage in conversation in dreams. However, the most salient feature of our dreams are vivid symbolic images, and also the often strange myth-like narratives that occur in our images. Now, Hillman also writes, by employing the dream as a model of psychic actuality and by conceiving a theory of personality based upon the dream, we are imagining the psyche's basic structure to be an inscape of personified images. we can describe the psyche as a polycentric realm of nonverbal, non-spatial images. In dreams, our minds understand things through the creation of what Hillman calls personified images. In other words, our deep minds digest our ideas, thoughts, and experiences by turning them into personas. Our deep minds naturally personify. And much of our Western intellectual and religious heritage has attacked personifying as either primitive behavior or a form of idolatry. However, Hillman and others hold that personifying ideas as personas is fundamental thinking about experience, including religious experience, and that to dismiss that which is personified as merely fictional or imaginary, or something that primitive people or children do, is a mistake. Instead, the act of or work of personifying is a way of being in the world and experiencing the world as a psychological field, where personas are given with events, so that events are experiences that touch us, move us, and appeal to us. Personifying makes abstract concepts real. As the philosopher and religious studies scholar Henry Corbin explained, now Corbin is a person who was very inspirational for Jung, and they had a very close intellectual relationship. Corbin explained that every universal concept must have its counterpart in the individual, a concrete person. Outside of ideal or mental reality remains virtuality and pure abstractions outside of personifying images. In other words, universal concepts like compassion do not exist in this world for us until they are manifested in concrete, particular examples. Apart from individual iterations, compassion has no reality. Personifying through the symbolic personas of the Bodhisattvas is a way of manifesting the universal for us and allowing us to be mindful of it and emulate it. The scientific revolution that began in the 17th century focused on explaining things rather than their moral significance. And this led to the explosion of technology in the last few centuries that has transformed human life. For us today, understanding really means explaining something, explaining the sequence of how something arises and how it comes into being. Now, there's no doubt that we need to learn causation of things for science, medicine, even for managing our own lives. And as you know, of course, causation is crucially important in Buddhism. But explanatory knowledge is not the only form of knowledge we need. Following the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey, Hillman makes a distinction between explaining and understanding. After the scientific revolution, we explain things, but in order to understand something, Hillman maintains that we must envision it as having an independent subjective existence, capable of experience, motivated by purposes and intentions. We must always think anthropomorphically and even personally. Even the intentions, purposes, and other sub-processes that enter into experience cannot be reduced merely to explanations. They too are open only to an anthropomorphic understanding. By understanding, Hillman does not mean being able to rationally explain something. He means a kind of participatory knowing. Participatory knowing is merging with something, incorporating it into yourself. Thus, for Hillman, understanding is a matter of incorporating something into ourselves, of making something our own. The Greeks called this type of knowledge gnosis. Our word to know in English is related to the ancient Greek word gnosis. Gnosis is not knowing a proposition or explanation for something, but it connotes an intimate form of knowing, a union with something. Some of the ways we use the word know or to know in older English reflect this sense of participatory knowing. For example, you may remember that in the King James translation of the Bible, the term to know is a pseudonym for sexual intercourse. In Indian religions, we might translate gnosis or participatory knowing into the word yoga, meaning union. In Japanese, for Japanese speakers, we could translate participatory knowing using the common phrase minitsukeru, Translated literally, minitsukeru means to attach some knowledge to oneself or make it part of oneself. The word mi explains or means one's body or oneself, and tsukeru means to attach or to affix something. To recap, bringing to mind and interacting with symbolic images is a powerfully effective, skillful means to transform ourselves, because the symbolic images, as Hillman argues, and Jung and others, is the primary stuff of our deep minds. And while we learn by becoming able to explain things, to understand what we have learned in order to unite it with us and incorporate with us, and we need to personify it. Let's take an example of learning the golf swing. Even if we read a book that scientifically explains the hows and whys of the golf swing, does that mean we really know how to swing the golf club and hit the ball properly? Trust me, it doesn't. We must actually go to the driving range and hit the ball many, many times. But when we are trying to improve our swing, we are constantly using our imagination. We look at others, especially the club professionals, and then we try to imprint their movements on our minds. We get closer to the right swing by imagining their movements, then imagining with our mind's eye that we are doing the same movements and hand grips. Over time, our imagination and our bodily movements slowly become one and the same. When this happens, we have finally embodied the golf swing. The Lotus Sutra provides personifications in the form of its bodhisattvas so that we can know compassion and wisdom in the symbolic, imaginal stuff of the deep mind, which helps our deep minds process compassion and wisdom. And mindfulness of the bodhisattvas depicted in the Lotus Sutra allows us to incorporate the teachings as participatory knowledge. In other words, the symbolic images of the teachings provided by the Lotus Sutra allow us to become one with the teaching. This is why they make great models and exemplars for us. I think the insights of Jung and Hillman help us to make sense of and help us to be more open to the imaginal language that sometimes appears in Founder Nimino when he, for example, when he talks about our mind resonating with the mind of the Bodhisattva, or of this idea of sympathetic response and making the Bodhisattva's mind our own. Now, one response to Founder Nimino's language could be, well, he's only speaking metaphorically. Well, perhaps. But I think that in these instances, the founder is not speaking metaphorically. Instead, he's speaking imaginally. Now, let's consider the imaginal sphere where the mindfulness of the Bodhisattvas of the Lotus Sutra might take place. Before, I asked you to pay attention to the imaginal language that Founder Nimino is using. Phrases like brings to mind, evokes images, and picture. Founder Nimino uses his imagination to ponder the story of Bodhisattva never unworthy of respect, expanding the rather bare-bones story of the sutra into an entire imaginal landscape. This is an imaginal interaction with the sutra. It's not merely repeating or reciting the text with his mind, but elaborating it, expanding it. It's as if the literary image provided by the sutra is like a rough outline or sketch, and Founder Nimino fills out the detail and he adds the colors. His guidance to ponder the sound regatta also enters into this imaginal sphere. To ponder wise and skillful compassion is not something like simply reciting the word compassion to ourselves, or even concentrating on the word compassion. Before we can contemplate the sound regatta, we need to bring an image of the sound regatta to mind. And this requires not only memory, but the powers of imagination. We can imagine the sound regatta based on the many artistic depictions of the sound regatta in Buddhism, or we can also imaginally enter the text of the sutra in the same kind of ways that Founder Nimino does in this example I gave you from chapter 20. Now, following Jung, Hillman, as well as the philosopher and religious studies scholar Henry Corbin, and also the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, who I'm really very indebted to for a lot of what's in this talk, I'm using the term imaginal rather than imagination. In colloquial language, imagination can mean something that is not real. For example, the phrase, something's a figment of your imagination. Imagination also means something subjective. That is, something that exists only within one's own mind, on one's own side, and reflects the biases of one's own way of thinking. But this kind of engaging in religious imagination that I'm talking about is different. It's where your mind and the perspectives, your mind and your perspectives meet those of the sutra, where the inner and the outer interweave in a form of dialogue. So to distinguish this from our ordinary understanding of imagination, I try to use the word imaginal. The imaginal is a place where our minds intermingle and become one with the stories of the Lotus Sutra. As Corbin described the imaginal, it is neither passive reception nor unconstrained fantasy. It mediates two realms of what would otherwise be the subjective and the objective. In this world, in the imaginal, the knower and known come to correspond. The idea of union of yoga I just talked about. With this world, within this world, or without this world of the imaginal, concepts remain divided. The imaginal provides a place for the resolution of the split between thought and being, subject and object, humanity and nature. So the imaginal is intersubjective rather than purely subjective or objective. In the description of the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke, the imaginal is transsubjective. Now, the scholar Gary Lachman talks about this imaginal capacity, and this is what he says. Now, he uses the word imagination. I'm trying to avoid it, but you'll see what I mean. So it is because we need imagination, or the imaginal, to grasp reality, that part of it immediately before us and its wider horizons that exceed the reach of our physical senses, that we can speak of a knowledge of the imagination. Now here he's sort of inspired by Kant. It is the source, the imagination or the imaginal is the source and medium of our other ways of knowing. It shows us aspects and dimensions of reality that we would dismiss without it, and which much, if not most of official Western culture has dismissed since the new way of knowing became dominant. While it can be used for fantasy, illusion, make-believe, and escapism, the real work of the imaginal is to make contact with the strange world in which we live and serve as both a guide and inspiration for our development within it. It is the way we evolve. Imagination presents us with the possible, potential realities that is our job to actualize. It also presents us with a world that would not be complete without our help. The stories of the sutra that we enter through the imagination, or the imaginal, as I'm saying, are elaborations of symbols and narrative. They're a myth, not in the sense of an ancient story that is some flight of fantasy, but what I mean by myth is the embodiment of truth in the form of a story that remains applicable across the ages. The primal stuff of the deep mind is the symbolic personification, but next comes the mythical story, the mythos. Its meaning, the meaning of the symbol gets embedded in the story. And even before mankind began distilling concepts from stories, we had the stories themselves, the mythos, transmitting the meaning to us. Entering the story imaginally or enacting it as a form of participatory knowledge, when we do that, we are also participating in the truth of the story, becoming one with the truth of the story. Now, actually, if you think about it, we still use mythical stories for world making and for transforming ourselves. Think of the devotion that people have to the Lord of the Rings saga or Star Trek and its characters. People identify with those characters, modeling themselves on them. Yet, the stories and characters are, from the standpoint of a scientific worldview, not real. They're not real. But in the way that the stories of Star Trek, for example, provide a vehicle for making sense of the world for people, and how people model themselves on those characters, often unconsciously, the people that do that are engaging in work of self-development and self-transformation. This is why I think the mythos is real, but real in a different way from we often think of as what is the really real. The mythos has real world consequences for us. Now, people today I think are actually thirsting for symbolic personas and mythical stories to make sense of our world. And I'll tell you why I think so. Because unfortunately, we often project our need for symbolic personas upon real world people who are actually quite dysfunctional. And we often turn rumors and fear into mythical narratives that also become dysfunctional. Also, not understanding how to use the imaginal sphere properly, we can literalize it, concretize it in the world. Now, this can lead to various types of fundamentalism. Since we've lost the spiritual capabilities of the imaginal, it has reappeared in our civilization as a pathology. And I'm thinking here of things like, for example, conspiracy theory. It's the mythos, it's the imaginal realm, but it leads us down a rat hole of unhealthy states of mind. So I think the healing solution is not a further rejection of the mythos, a dismissal of personifying, or refusal of the imaginal. That would be repression. And when we repress what is natural to us, it often resurfaces as pathology. I think the solution is to regain the lost art of the spiritual imagination in a healthy way. So my invitation to you to enter the spiritual imaginal and engage with the symbolic personas and mythical stories of the Lotus Sutra is not a call to return to some kind of pre-modern way of looking at the world. As the philosopher Ken Wilber observes, we can never again really see through the eyes of those of the epochs that came before us, because to do that would really require us not having modern ways of looking at the world. But we can recover the use of the imagination and personifying, especially in their spiritual lives, that the modern world has largely rejected, repressed, and forgotten. Entering into the imaginal, engaging the symbolic personas and stories is something like play or active imagination. It is a different frame from our normal reality, a place where we suspend the normal judgments of what is real, like what we do when we play, in the normal sense of the word. The imaginal is a realm of as if. We suspend judgment and act and think as if. Now, play as a form of learning is something that we see children do when they imitate adults. For example, children sometimes play house. You'll see little kids doing this. Well, they did when I was a little kid. I don't know about now. So children pretend, for example, to be cooking, making, and pouring tea and so forth. Within the frame of play, the child could be serving tea. However, this does not mean that the child actually sees tea in the teacup. Yet, the play is very real in a different sense. The child is stepping into the adult roles, the adult behaviors, and the adult identities it sees within its own family, and it's trying to understand those roles and behaviors by patterning them. Mimesis, imitation. Now, in the animal kingdom, we see animals do this all the time. For instance, let's say two bears, black bears the two cubs have a fight, a play fight. And they never really bite hard enough to hurt and injure one another. As Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson established, with certain meta-communicative symbols, participants establish a frame for play where everything within the frame is both what it seems and at the same time not what it seems. It is, but it isn't. Now, through the action of play, the bear cubs acquire the skills they need to defend themselves and survive as adults. Thus, play is real. It transforms them. It has real-world consequences. Without play, they will never have a chance at survival. So play can be serious business, especially when it is a form of modeling. So summarizing what some scholars, many scholars and scientists have learned about play, the psychologist Jordan Peterson describes as follows. Play allows for the permanent extension of competence and confidence through pretense. Play creates a world in a rule-governed fantasy in episodic or imaginistic representation, in which behavior can be rehearsed, mastered prior to its expression in the real world, but with real-world consequences. Play is another form of as-if behavior that allows for experimentation with a fictional narrative. Pretended descriptions of the world, of the current desired future states of the world, with plans of action appended designed to change the former into the latter. Notice that what he's saying is the long-term point of modeling play is to transform the current state of things into what we want to exist in the future. Now, as practitioners of Buddhism, what we want to do is transform our current selves into our future selves, which are Buddhists. As Rissho Kosei-kai traditionally describes this transformation, it's the perfection of our characters. And we could also maybe use a meme like something more contemporary, like, for example, the marketing meme, be all you can be. When serious play is done in a religious practice or spiritual practice, we also enter an as-if realm. And the anthropologist T.M. Luhrmann calls this spiritual as-if realm the faith frame. And the anthropologist writes, to choose to think within the faith frame is a decision to enter another mode of thinking about reality that calls on the resources of the imagination, or I would say the imaginal, to reorganize what is fundamentally real. This involves a shift in perspective similar to the shift in and out of imaginative play, except that the play claims also serious, it makes also serious claims about the world. Now, this frame coexists alongside the ordinary ways people make sense of the world, but it allows us to remake ourselves in relationship, he says, to an other that cannot be seen. Now, he's generally referring to religions like Christianity, but for Buddhists, this other that Luhrmann speaks of are the Bodhisattvas of the Lotus Sutra that are our models. In a sense, these Bodhisattvas, they are ourselves, our future selves. As President Niwano has recently said in his June 2021 message, our inherent power to rise from the depths of suffering and grow by turning suffering into nourishment is in fact the wondrous wisdom power of the regarder of sounds. As a personification of our inner capabilities, we are, in a sense, modeling ourselves upon who we will be in the future. We are modeling our present selves on our future selves. Thus, personifying and interacting with the symbolic persona of the Lotus Sutra is not a form of idolatry, nor is it a form of alienation. It's a way to give form to our inner capabilities, to engage that form, and then to reincorporate it in a holistic way by transforming the entirety of our being. So what I've been trying to do is, so far, is to draw upon some modern scholars and philosophers, specifically Jung Hillman, also John Vervaeke, to which I'm particularly indebted to Viveka. I think he's very wonderful. His work is just very enlightening. So I'm drawing on people like this to make the case that for the value of interacting with the Lotus Sutra symbolic personifications of the teaching and engaging the sutra's mythological stories in the sphere of the imaginal. And I think if we can be open to this kind of practice, more of the teachings of founder Niona and Rissho Kosei-kai will begin to make sense to those of us from contemporary Western cultures. Now, founder Niona was convinced that Buddhism is rational and compatible with modernity. But like I said before, there is also very much of the imaginal in his approach to practice. And I think that it's those aspects of his teachings and guidance that prove the most difficult for people in other cultures today. Again, let's go back to his characterization of true liberation. Ultimately, founder Niona's description of true liberation is a personifying that arises from an imaginal space. He talks of true liberation as the conviction that the eternal original Buddha is always together with you, always alongside of you. You are never, ever alone. If I were to abstract out the principle or concept from founder Niona's personifying imaginal, I could say that, well, maybe all dharmas are suchness, all dharmas are truth, all phenomena is truth. Or I could say that all things are Buddha nature. Now, it's fine. I think we need to do that. I think we need to bring it to that place. But I also think that if we dismiss the founder's imaginal personifying after extracting the abstract concept behind it, I think we might be losing a chance to use a powerful faith frame, a powerful, skillful means that we can apply to our daily lives. By extracting out a concept, what we're doing is necessary explaining, right? We're explaining, but we're not knowing. We're not experiencing through gnosis. So I think there's an extra step I think we have to go. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is, I've been talking about the theory until now, and I've been sort of making a sort of a rational case, a scientific or a psychological and cognitive case for the imaginal and personifying and interacting with the sutra in that way. So now I'd like to turn to some practical application. So let me give you a couple examples of how I personally meet the sutra in the imaginal realm as part of my own practice. And then afterwards, I'd like to hear from the rest of you. Okay, so let's go to chapter 25. Now in chapter 25, we have the 33 embodiments of the sound regarder. And the 33 embodiments are elaborated in detail in the prose portion of the chapter, not in the verse, but in the prose. And traditionally, we tend to think of them as, well, one way to explain the metaphors and the symbolic personalities is that they're, we're trying to, as Bodhisattvas, we should be able to transform ourselves into the person that other people need us to believe. We need to respond to people in the way they need us to respond to them so we can lead them to liberation. But there's another way to look at it. And actually, this is something that I heard the minister of the Suginami Dharma Center in Tokyo speak about this chapter. And it's very, very enlightening. And it's very, very in line with the historical ways of discussing this chapter. We can view the 33 embodiments also as the workings of the Buddha in the world that we encounter, our encounters, the types of people we encounter. The 33 embodiments can be kind of categories of people that we encounter. Categories of people that we encounter for the benefit of our awakening, that lead us to liberation, that give us the teachings we need, that give us the messages from the Buddha. The interesting thing is, if you go through the 33 embodiments, not all of them are nice, cuddly people. Some of them are kind of folks you don't really want to meet so often. For example, there's a category. There's all these sort of mythical personas in that list, sometimes they're referred to as the 8 guardians, or the 8 types of guardians. And here's the description right here. For those whose liberation requires the physical form of a heavenly being, a dragon, a yaksha, a gandharva, ashura, garuda, kimnara, mahoraga, or human or non-human being, the sound regarder appears in the appropriate form and expounds the Dharma for them. Now, all of these characters are, if you were walking down the street and you bumped into them, they'd scare the living hell out of you. They're kind of scary. Here's a look at them. They don't look like people you want to be your neighbors. They're not so nice and cuddly. And so the top ones are the heavenly beings, and these are basically the different Devi. And then the bottom are the non-human beings, right? And we have the on the right hand side we have the Mahoraga, and then all the way to the left hand side we got the dragon, right? And let's see. So here's an Ashura, a nice looking fellow, looks very friendly, and so one of the things that happens in our lives is we meet people that we clash with, we bump up against, people that are difficult. And Founder Nichiren teaches us that those are the kind of relationships you have to pay attention to, because they're the ones that really, our suffering is really the stuff of nourishment, of our awakenings. So one of the ways that I try to think about the people who I'd rather not interact with, that I'd rather get away from, are they fit into some of these categories of the embodiments of the sound regarder that can scare the living daylights out of you. And so one is the Ashura, or the Asura, right? I tend to use the Japanese pronunciation. Now, the Ashura is characterized by jealousy. And we often meet people in our lives that are jealous, right? And because they're jealous, man, they tend to fight with us, right? And so, especially recently, there's actually a particular person that I view as an Ashura. And I try to remind myself and try to think of this category in the sutra, this category of these wonderful, scary people. And if you chant the sutra in the Sino-Japanese, it's easier to remember. It rolls off the tongue. Ken datsaba ashura kim nara naraga mahoraga nimpi ninto, and it's easy to remember this category. But anyway. So the sutra is telling me that these people, these characters, these personas are appearing in my life for my purpose, to give me a message from the Buddha, even if they're just really difficult to deal with. And so I have some ashuras in my life, and I need to appreciate them somehow as giving me a message from the Buddha. That interaction is going to lead me to an enlightenment, an awakening, and I need to have faith. So that person is the ashura. And so that's one example. Another example is of these beings is the yaksha. Now, the yaksha in India, often they're thought of as these sort of spirits that inhabit the forests. And it's one of the reasons why you don't want to hang out in the forest, and why what Shakyamuni did, walking into the forest to practice for 6 years, was considered kind of not a very smart thing to do, because the yakshas are waiting for you. And what they do is they eat your brain. And this is the story, right? So I tend to think of, what is this? How is this? What are the yakshas in my life? The brain, my psyche, my soul. So I think of the yaksha is a kind of the kind of person that they call the psychic vampire, or the emotional vampire that sucks away your psychic energy. And I got a bunch of those people in my life. And, when I've engaged them, when I followed the teaching and I've engaged those people, I really have had, I've had precious experiences. So I've learned, and I don't always follow what I've learned. I forget all the time. So I've got to constantly recite the sutra, enter the imaginal. This is my world. My world is the 33 embodiments of the sound regarder all around me. So I've got some yakshas in my life. Here's another example, the Garuda. Now, the Garuda is another really copacetic character who, he's like or she they're like a phoenix in a way. They're fiery birds. They're fiery, they're passionate, and they eat dragons. I think of the fire and the passion, and I think of that kind of alpha person who's so animated and in your face and full of energy, but it's sometimes difficult to deal with. And so I got some Garudas in my life. And in fact, when I was preparing last night, one of my Garudas started texting me. And I, I was busy, but I said, okay, I've got to engage with the sound regarder. And the Garuda is my sound regarder for right now. And so this is one of the ways. And there's been times, to tell you the truth, in my life recently, there's been times where there was a character in my life, a real living person, who in some ways is like the yaksha, or excuse me, the ashura, but and in other ways, because they're kind of a person with authority, they also are the magistrate. The magistrate is one of the 33 embodiments. And your magistrates are, well, we can think of them as judges and sort of bureaucrats. They don't always rule in our favor. Have you ever dealt with them? They're people you kind of want to avoid, right? No, we can't avoid them. We have to engage them. We have to, whenever we find ourselves pulling back and trying to avoid, that's the message that we've got to engage, right? So there's a Garuda, right? Now, another example of how we can, so I'll give you an example of sort of how I work with the story itself, the mythic story, as a sort of a perspective or spectacles I can put on, and I can I'm sorry, I'm going to try to ignore that bell. It's probably not for us anyway, because it's a day off here. Can you hear the bell? The ping pong? Okay, good. So another possibility to interact with the images of the sound regarder. The sound regarder has a wealth of depictions, and so many. And if you just look at these depictions, we've got sort of the sound regarder who is like, this is a Noidin Konon, I believe, who usually has a wish fulfilling jewel, granting people's wishes. Then we've got over here next, moving towards the right, this character sort of looks like kind of like an older ancient Chinese woman. Looks very Chinese, maybe a sort of grandmotherly figure. And the sound regarder could be a grandmotherly figure. Please wait 1 second. People are at the door here in my office, and they're banging on the door. すいません、ちょっと図を書いて中です。国際電話で、はい。Okay, sorry about that. I'm also Rusuban, so while I'm here. Okay, then we've got here is we've got the 1,000-armed sound regarder, and this is you might know this depiction from the Hoden Kaku Hall. And if you have a really good depiction and you can see all the different things that the sound regarder holds in its hand, some of them are nice little things like vases of water, and some are like axes, and then we have the 11-headed sound regarder over here, 11-headed, and we can think of it as the 10 heads or the 10 realms, of the cosmos, and also of our heart, from the hell realms all the way up to the Buddha realm. And then we can think of the sort of the 11th one as encompassing all of them, as the sort of the overall sort of embodiment of all of them. Okay, some more depictions. So on the left, we have the horse-headed sound regarder. And this is a depiction you probably never come across in the States, although it's possible in the Tibetan Dharma Center you might come across it, because it's kind of important in Tibetan Buddhism. And you see there's a horse coming out of the sound regarder's head. Very animalistic, right? Animals, instinct, right? So that's kind of So the sound regarder as an animalistic, instinctual person. Maybe I can identify with that person. Or maybe this type of sound regarder represents kind of my shadow. Then we have the standard form of kanon. I think this is a Arya Alokoteshvara, or Shokanon in Japanese. And then I think we have another version of the wish-fulfilling, the Noiden kanon, the wish-fulfilling kanon right here. So there are many, many depictions. They're basically, they're innumerable, so to speak, right? And that's the great thing about the sound regarder. The sound regarder essentially is, the teachings are innumerable. From the one Dharma arises the innumerable meanings, right? And that's kind of where the sound regarder works. And there's a sound regarder, a version of sound regarder that's called the Maria Kannon. Maria being, Maria, the Virgin that gave birth to Jesus in the Christian teachings. And you can see statues of this quote unquote Maria Kannon nursing a baby. And that could be a kanon that maybe someone who's takes care of a child, who's a caregiver, really identifies with as an image of the perfect parent or the perfect caregiver, right? And so we can contemplate these images, and these images can speak to us. I think they're very, especially because the diversity of the sound regarder, is the depiction of the sound regarder is just amazing. Now traditionally the most common number is 6, but it's just innumerable. It really is. And that's the wondrous thing about the sound regarder, responding to our needs. And so I think we can bring to mind, and depending on our state of mind and what we need at the time, I think we could even sort of think about a different version of the sound regarder, a different depiction. So I think there's a lot of possibilities. And with this applicational portion of the sutra, and I would invite you to interact with it symbolically, imaginally, and I think it can be something that can really give you a lot of inspiration. Okay, so that's about it for my talk today. Thank you for listening. And I think maybe we'll have some time for discussion.